false teachers had come to Colossae to convince the Christians that Jesus wasn't enough. That if they really wanted to experience a deeper salvation, a better rescue, an enhanced freedom, a more enlightened knowledge, a heightened power, then they needed more than Jesus. And lest we think that this was only a problem back then, we too are being bombarded every single day to believe in something other than Jesus, to embrace something smaller than Jesus, to satisfy our longings for approval and acceptance and affection and all of those things. The world today is not that much different than the world that Paul was writing to. All around us, we too are being sold a bill of goods. All around us, we are being bombarded with this idea that Jesus isn't enough. If you want more power, enhanced freedom, if you want deeper salvation, a better rescue, then you're going to have to look to something or someone other than Jesus in order to have it. The false teachers were telling the Colossian Christians that they needed to do certain things, that there were certain standards and traditions that they needed to uphold, that there were rules that they needed to keep in addition to Jesus, if they wanted to experience the freedom that they were longing for. And Paul wrote this letter to prove that you don't need anything more than what Jesus has already earned for you and freely given to you. He wrote to make this point: Jesus plus nothing equals everything, and that everything minus Jesus equals nothing. Now, up until this point, so far in this letter, Paul has only hinted at what the false teachers were selling. And he does this by using certain words over and over again. You see this in chapter 1, you see this in chapter 2 so far. He uses words like knowledge and fullness and deliverance. And the reason he uses those words very intentionally is to show that this was, in fact, what the false teachers were selling. They were selling things like deeper knowledge, more fullness, a greater deliverance. And so Paul works really hard, up until this point very vaguely, to show that you can only have those things in Christ. But his attack on the false teachers up until this point has been pretty vague. But in this section, chapter 2, verse 8, all the way through verse 23, his attack is no longer vague and general. It is very frontal and forthright. He lays out very, very specifically what the false teachers are selling, and he says, don't buy it. He explicitly lists things that were vying for the heart of the Colossians, and he mentions these things very explicitly in this whole section. Worldly thinking, human traditions, religious rules, asceticism, counterfeit spiritualities. He outlines all of these things in verses 8 through 23. Now, after Easter, we're going to look at verses 16 through 23, but this morning I want to look specifically at verses 8 through 15, because Paul's ongoing point is simply this: don't buy a false version of what you already possess. Last week I used the illustration of embarrassingly looking, and I've done this on numerous occasions, looking around the house frantically for my sunglasses when either one of my children or my wife gently reminds me that they're on my head. And we laugh at that and say, gosh, that's funny, what moron does something like that? Well, the fact of the matter is, this is essentially what Paul is addressing. Don't purchase what you already own. You're looking for something that you already possess. Don't buy it, he's saying to the Colossians. He continues to preach the gospel over and over and over again to the Colossians, reminding them of what they have, reminding them of the riches in Christ they already possess, so that they won't go out looking for something smaller than Jesus, so that they won't purchase or buy from these sellers, from these false teachers, what they already own. But before he points out what we shouldn't buy, which he does very explicitly in verses 16 through 23, he points out in verses 8 through 15 why we shouldn't buy it. So you can divide this section, verse 8 through 23, into two parts. Verses 8 through 15 tells us why we shouldn't buy false versions of what we already possess. And then in verses 16 to 23, he outlines very explicitly what it is that we shouldn't buy. And his point in doing this is because he understands that it's only when we come to a better understanding of what we already possess in Christ will we be able to identify and then resist the counterfeit offerings of this world. Don't buy, in other words, a false freedom. Don't buy false security. Don't buy false knowledge. Don't buy false approval and false affection and false acceptance, because you already have those things in Christ. It's amazing if you just read chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 of Colossians in one sitting, and simply use a pencil to circle every time the Apostle Paul says these two words, in him. You'll be circling it a lot, because one of the main features, if not the main feature, of Colossians is the doctrine of union with Christ. What does it really mean to be united to Christ? And how do we experience the benefits that go along with being united to Christ? That's what this letter is all about. So he wants to show what union with Christ really means, and then to demonstrate all of the blessings and benefits that are ours as a result of being united to Christ, so that we will then be properly equipped to resist the temptation to buy anything smaller than what we already possess. That's why he begins in verses 16 to 23, or begins in verses 8 through 15, showing why we shouldn't buy it. He tells us, he reminds us once again in these verses, this is what you have, Christian. This is what you possess. This is what is yours already. Okay, you got that? You understand that, Christian? Okay, now let me show you what it is they're selling. And if you understand what you already possess, what you already own, you'll be less likely to buy. That's what's going on here in these verses. He begins, Paul does, in verse 8 of chapter 2 with a warning about the false teachers. He gives sort of this general warning, and he uses, interestingly, a play on words throughout this section, verses 8 through 15, to distinguish what the false teachers are selling to them and what Jesus has already purchased for them. He calls what they're selling, look at verse 8, he calls what they're selling enslaving, empty, and elemental, or earthly. He says in verse 8, see to it that no one takes you captive, enslaving, by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. So he uses these three adjectives and says what they're selling is enslaving, what they're selling is empty, and what they're selling is elemental or earthly. And then what he does in verses 9 through 15 is he uses this play on words, and he says essentially what Jesus offers is freedom instead of slavery, fullness instead of emptiness, and an eternal identity instead of an earthly one. So he lays out three things in verses 9 through 15 that specifically counter what these false teachers are selling. And he uses this play on words. You see that here when he uses the word empty in verse 8, and then in verse 9, twice he uses a version of the word fullness. He does that intentionally. He's using this play on words intentionally to compare and to contrast what Jesus offers compared to what these false teachers were offering. So I want to look just quickly at the fact that Jesus offers freedom instead of slavery, fullness instead of emptiness, and an eternal identity instead of an earthly one. First, Jesus offers freedom instead of slavery. The false teachers were saying that what they were selling would make you free. And if you look back in chapter 1, verse 14, most Bible scholars agree, verse 13 actually, most Bible scholars agree that when Paul uses the word delivered in verse 13, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us, which is another form of that word. He's using that word very specifically to indicate that deliverance is what these false teachers are selling. Freedom is what these false teachers are selling. But they're not selling true deliverance. They're not selling true freedom. Only Jesus can offer true deliverance. Only Jesus can offer true freedom. And so he says essentially here that what they are selling you might look like freedom at first, but it's really slavery. It's enslaving. What they're selling you will capture you, not in the liberation sense of the word, but in the enslavement sense of the word. The word captivity here literally means arrest or kidnap. And the point he wants to make is that adding something to Jesus leads to less, not more. It leads to slavery, not freedom. So you see, the world would have you to believe that the bigger you get, the freer you will be. But the gospel says, actually, it's the other way around. The smaller you get, the freer you will be. If you look at verses 8 through 23, if you just read those verses all together, then you will notice very obviously that Paul's primary target in this whole section is legalism. God hates legalism because legalism is a form of self-righteousness. It's an attempt on our part to make ourselves right before God. The Bible speaks out very harshly against legalism, which is just an expression of what Adam and Eve were trying to do in the Garden of Eden with their disobedience. I can be like God. And so self-righteousness has always been at bottom of every sin. Every sin springs up from self-righteousness, an attempt on our part to cover ourselves, to make ourselves right before God. Legalism, let me just give you a little bit of a definition of legalism so you understand it properly. Legalism is the idea that you become acceptable through your doing. Okay? That you gain approval by keeping the rules, maintaining the standards, upholding the values. That's legalism. And there are religious forms of legalism, and there are irreligious forms of legalism or secular forms of legalism. The secular form of legalism is an approach to life that says, if I can do it, if I can improve, if I can achieve, then I'll be approved by the world. I'll be approved by other people. I'll even be approved by myself. That's secular, irreligious legalism. Religious legalism, which is what Paul attacks here, is an approach to life that says, if I can do it, if I can keep the rules, then I'll be approved by God. You see, they're identical. The means are identical. It's the end that's different. It's the goal. Secular legalism says, if I can improve, then the world will accept me. Religious legalism says, if I can improve, if I can keep the standards, if I can keep the rules, then God will accept me. But both forms have one thing in common. Gaining approval depends on you. It's your doing that gets you the approval of other people, that gets you the approval of God. At first, and Jerry Bridges, I was reading this last night in his remarkable book, Transforming Grace. Excellent book. If you haven't read it, read Jerry Bridges' Transforming Grace. But in chapter 1, he says that all of us are by nature legalists. That the human heart naturally bends toward legalism. And I read that last night and I thought, what is it about legalism that is so attractive to us? As I thought about it more and more and more, this is what I came up with. Legalism, at first anyway, seems attractive because it puffs us up by giving us the illusion that we can do it. That we can generate our own meaning, that we can generate our own purpose, that we can generate our own security. It puffs us up, and it gives us the impression that we can do it on our own. We establish standards and rules that we can keep. And if we maintain our own standards and if we keep our own rules, then we will feel pretty good about ourselves. And we will be able to control our little world. Legalism provides us with a way to avoid acknowledging our deficiencies and our inabilities. Think about why legalism is so attractive. Because legalism provides us with a way to avoid acknowledging our deficiencies. It provides us with a way to avoid acknowledging our inabilities. It offers us a way to avoid Jesus and keep control of our lives. A legalistic approach to life is all about you. And all of us have become pretty adept to establishing some rules and some standards that are achievable. And as long as we can maintain the standards and keep the rules that we've established for ourselves, then we will think pretty highly of ourselves, we'll maintain control of our little world, we'll protect ourselves from the chaos without. That's why legalism is so attractive. We are, by nature, proud people. And legalism feeds that pride by trying to convince us that our acceptance, our approval, our significance, our meaning, our purpose can be accomplished simply by setting up a set of rules, maintaining some standards, upholding some values. And if we can do that, then we will be able to attain, in a sense, the rightness that we're looking for. You see, have you ever asked yourself, why do we, and even if you're a Christian, you do this on a daily basis because this is what sin is, why do we avoid the gospel? If all of us were honest, we would admit that each and every day, We try to avoid the gospel at some level. We do. That's what sin is. It's flight from God in thought, word, or deed, whatever. It's flight from God. Flight from God is an avoidance of the gospel. Why do we avoid the gospel? I'll tell you why. At least I'll admit why I avoid the gospel. Because the gospel makes you disappear. That's why. The gospel erases you. And now it's no longer about your little world and your standards and your rules and your preferences. It's no longer about you. It's no longer about what you want. It's no longer about your abilities. It's no longer about your strength. It's no longer about who you are and what you can attain and what you can achieve. The gospel erases you in that sense, which is why we avoid it. See, after a while, legalism, or what I call performanceism, after a while we realize that legalism equals slavery. Think about this. Being the star of our own show actually makes life a tragedy. It does. When life is all about you, your world becomes small and smothering. You shrink. When everything is riding on us, it leads to despair, not deliverance. You know that to be true. When you live life believing that it's all about your ability to keep the rules, your ability to maintain the standards, your ability, whatever. And then your kid starts going out of control, your finances are out of control, things are happening in life because we live in a broken world and we're fallen people living amongst other fallen people. And the little world that we've created that's easily controllable by the standards and the rules that we've established, the little world that we've created for ourselves that in essence make us feel safe, when those worlds begin to crumble, it leads to despair. When everything is riding on us, when the well-being of my children, when the well-being of our finances, when all of our relationships, the relational health of every relationship we have, when all of life and the success of life is riding on your shoulders, is riding on my shoulders, you know as well as I do, parents especially, that doesn't lead to deliverance. It leads to despair because you come face to face with your own frailty, with your own weaknesses, and you realize even though you're trying to put up a front so that everybody else can believe you're strong, you know down deep inside you are weak and incapable of maintaining the little world you've created for yourself. That's what legalism does. It becomes a counterfeit God. It becomes a self-salvation project. Is what it is. Oftentimes we hear legalism as people inside the church and we think, oh, legalism is what the Pharisees were guilty of. They were trying to earn their salvation by keeping the rules. And we don't, Ephesians 2:8 now, we're Ephesians 2:8-9 people. By grace you're saved through faith. And it's not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. We understand that. Legalism infects saved people. People who believe that we have been saved by grace and that one day we will be taken to heaven by grace, but in between the times, it's up to us. Somehow along the way, the gospel gets us in, and then we leave the gospel behind, and our relationship with God becomes all about performance, how we're doing. It becomes about you again. Remember, the gospel is the only thing that can crush our legalistic tendencies and set us free, because the gospel focuses not on what we must do, but on what Christ has already done. So, in comparison to the slavery that he mentions in verse 8, listen to this. Verse 13 through 15. He writes this in a state of controlled ecstasy. And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt. Listen to the legal language now. By canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands you could not make. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. That's the gospel, pure and simple. And notice what he says. It makes you free. Because our great high priest has come and done for sinners what sinners could never do for themselves. And so we avoid the gospel because it makes us disappear. But we understand real freedom when we disappear and Jesus appears, and all of life now becomes about him and not us. Remember, I've said this before, real freedom is living for something because you already have favor, instead of living for something in order to gain favor. Just unpack that for a moment. Because every single one of us, I don't care if you've been a Christian for 50 years, you're still a sinner. And that means that every single one of us is at some level living for something in order to gain favor. Could be your children, could be your spouse, could be your job, it could be your status in society, it could be your grandchildren. That's slavery. Real freedom is living for something because you already have favor. That's the gospel. Instead of living for something in order to gain favor. But not only does Jesus offer freedom instead of slavery, he also offers fullness instead of emptiness. And this is what he says. In comparison to the emptiness the false teachers are selling, which is what he says in verse 8, Jesus offers fullness. Twice in verse 9, he uses a version of the word full or fullness to contrast with the emptiness that he mentions in verse 8. He says, in comparison to the emptiness the false teachers are selling, Jesus offers fullness. They're telling you that what they are offering is fullness, but it's really emptiness. And it's only Jesus who can offer eternal fullness because the fullness of God dwells in him. That's what he says. Now, I could spend a month simply unpacking that part of verse 9 where it says, for in him the whole fullness of deity dwells. That is a theologically rich, packed statement. I don't have the time to spend 4 weeks unpacking that, but I looked that phrase up yesterday, and this is what it means literally. The full content of God lives in Jesus. That's what it means. Now, why does Paul bring that up here? Throughout history, philosophers have talked about a God-shaped hole in the human heart, a bottomless abyss, if you will, inside us, which we do anything to fill. And it's really a famous metaphor for the yearning in the human soul which drives our pursuits. And most people take that phrase, God-shaped void in the human soul, and trace it back to Blaise Pascal, French mathematician, who wrote this. What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty trace? This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God Himself. Now, what is Pascal getting at? It's a real fancy way of saying that every single one of us have a God-shaped void in our lives that only God is big enough to fill. That's what he's saying. That because we are creatures made in the image of God, and because that relationship with God, because of sin, has been severed, we have these eternal, transcendent longings, cravings that we seek in things smaller than Jesus to satisfy. But Paul's point is that a finite thing cannot fill an infinite void. That Jesus alone possesses the eternal resources we need to satisfy our eternal yearnings, because Jesus is eternal. When you place your ultimate trust in the finished work of Christ, then all He's secured for sinners, in other words, becomes yours. Access to God and affection from God can never be lost. The riches of God's pardon and power become yours in Him. I could stand up here week after week and make a very compelling argument for the fact that every single one of us is trying to gain access to something in the life of someone. That we have this eternal longing to gain access. We have this eternal longing to gain affection. And so we look to everything under the sun to try to satisfy that longing, to try to satisfy that craving. And what Paul is saying is, nothing in this world can satisfy your otherworldly longings. Nothing. We don't need to spend our lives, in other words, trying to earn the approval and acceptance of those around us, because Jesus has already earned God's approval and acceptance for us. Do you understand how liberating that is? We talk about the gospel of grace, the gospel that brings freedom. That's the kind of freedom we're talking about. Because all of us at some level are enslaved to our inability or lack thereof to gain the approval of those around us, to gain the acceptance of those around us. We're all doing it all the time. If you think to yourself right now, I don't do that, then you don't know yourself. You're delusional. Okay, you do. You do. I do. We all do it, whether we're conscious of it or not. The purpose of preaching is to highlight those idols, for instance, that we may not be aware of in our lives, and then preach the gospel so the gospel can smash it. That's the goal of preaching. To help both Christians and non-Christians who are gathered identify those things, those people that they are looking to provide for them what only Jesus is capable of providing. So, there's this ongoing discussion in churches about, should the worship service be geared toward Christians, or should the worship service be geared toward non-Christians? And I say, you are asking the wrong questions and therefore coming up with the wrong answers. The worship service is geared toward sinners, of which Christians and non-Christians are a part, and the only thing that can solve a sinner's problem is the gospel. So the gospel is for Christians and non-Christians. It's for people who know God, and it's for people who don't know God. We don't have to make the choice of whether or not the worship service, are we going to gear it toward non-Christians? Are we going to gear it toward Christians? What do we gear it toward? But it's irrelevant. It's an irrelevant discussion. My job doesn't change regardless of how many Christians or non-Christians are sitting out there. It's to preach the gospel. It's to showcase Jesus and show Him to be the only one who can eternally satisfy our eternal longings. And so what we find in the gospel is that the freedom that goes along with not needing to earn the approval and acceptance of those around us because Jesus has already earned God's approval and acceptance for us. Listen, because of Christ's finished work, sinners can have the justification, the love, the mercy, the grace, the cleansing, the new beginning, the security, the protection, the righteousness, and the rescue that they long for. All of us long for all of those things. And we're looking to something or someone to satisfy those longings. And what Paul shows is that you can't find that stuff in anything smaller than Jesus. A temporary thing cannot fill an eternal void. So what they are offering is empty. What Christ offers is fullness. The fullness of God dwells in Him, and you have been filled in Him if you're a Christian. Which means all of those longings are satisfied in Christ alone. Don't buy what you already have. But he also shows here, not only does he show that the gospel offers freedom instead of slavery and fullness instead of emptiness, but he also shows here that it offers an eternal identity instead of an earthly one. Scholars in verse 8 specifically disagree over Paul's meaning of the word elemental. There's disagreement about what he means there, and there are specifically 3 different interpretations of what it could mean. You'd be bored if I went through all 3 of those. So let me just say this, that it probably means worldly. That's most likely what it means. The NIV, I think, translates, the New International Version translates this phrase properly, I think, when it translates it, the basic principles of this world. If that's what Paul means, and I believe it is, then what he's saying is, don't build your life around the things of this world. Don't locate your identity in the things of this world. That's what he's saying. He says, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. In the Bible, the word worldliness means sort of the spirit of the world in a general sense. It's not referring specifically to any spirits in a personal sense, or spirit in a personal sense. It's speaking about the overarching ethos of the world, how the world operates, the world system, so to speak. A philosophy of life minus Jesus, an approach to living minus the gospel. That's what he's talking about here. And he's saying, don't build your life around the things of this world. Don't locate your identity in the things of this world. Now, how tempting is this? Every day, the world tempts us to locate our identity in something or someone smaller than Jesus. For instance, a couple examples. We are strongly tempted every day to conclude that our worth, our value, our significance is directly tied to what we can attain, what we can achieve, what we can accomplish. Isn't it? Our meaning in life, our value to society revolves around who our friends are, what we can become, our ability to perform. But in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2, Paul shows that our identity is not located in something we can do or someone we must become. Our identity is in Christ. He says 3 things in verse 11 and 12. He says, we were, past tense now, past perfect. We were, it's a done deal if you're a Christian. If you've been united to Christ, you've already been circumcised, you've already been buried, and you've already been raised in Christ. Now, what is he getting at there? What he's saying is, you've been given new life. The old is gone. The new has come. You have a new name. You have a new identity. The parallel verse to verse 11 and 12 is chapter 3, verse 3 of Colossians, where Paul writes, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God." That's exactly what he's saying in verse 11 and 12 of chapter 2. Same thing. For you have died. You are gone. Now, he's not saying your personhood is gone, your personality is gone. He's not saying that. He's saying that your identity, those things that you banked on to make life worth living, that you used to live for, are now gone. You have a new identity. Your identity is now swallowed up in Jesus. Your identity is now anchored in Christ. Remember a few weeks ago, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, I mentioned at the end of my sermon the story of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus told. And, you know, the rich man is in hell and Lazarus is in heaven. And the rich man says to God, "Would you please send Lazarus back to my brothers to warn them of this heinous place?" And God essentially says to the rich man, "No, they've been warned through the law and the prophets and whatnot." The interesting thing about that story, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, is that Lazarus maintains his identity in eternity. The rich man in the story had no name. Now, the underlying principle there is that Lazarus located his identity in something that could never fade away, namely a relationship with God. He was in Christ. The rich man, on the other hand, had located his identity in his possessions, in his achievements, in his wealth, and therefore, when he died, because his identity was so swallowed up in those things, when he died, in a sense, he lost himself. He was in eternity a man without a name. Lazarus is identified, the rich man simply called the rich man. The world tempts us every single day to locate our identity in something smaller than Jesus. But Paul wants us to know, chapter 3, verse 3, "For you have died and your life is now hidden or swallowed with Christ in God." That's who you are. You're a Christ one. You are you redeemed. That's what Paul wants us to know. Now, let me just quickly tell you how this rather abstract doctrine changes your life here and now. Okay, because, it's one thing to say union with Christ. Most people don't know what in the world that means. It's one thing to say union with Christ. Our identity is now located in Christ. We've been united to Christ. It's one thing to affirm that, believe that, and say that. It's another thing for the power of that to become a reality for you when the rubber meets the road, in the heat of life. How does that make a difference to you this afternoon? It's not just a doctrine that we're mentally affirming. It's a power that we are given access to. So, couple examples, some practical examples. How does this rather abstract doctrine change your life here and now? Listen, because our identity is in Christ, we can admit our weaknesses freely without feeling deflated. Think about that. How easy is it, men specifically, to admit your weaknesses, to admit that you're wrong, to admit that you're not an expert on everything? Okay, now I hear women laughing, so women, how hard is it for you to admit that you're wrong, to admit that you're weak? If I give him an inch, he'll take a mile. Okay? It's hard. It's hard to admit our weaknesses. But do you understand that when you truly get the fact that we are united to Christ and our identity is now located in Him, in His strength and not our own, we can freely admit our weaknesses with a smile and not feel deflated. Because our identity is not located in our strengths, it's located in Christ's strength. So now I can admit my weaknesses, I can admit my faults and my failures, and do so freely without feeling like I gotta save face. That's slavery. Because our identity is in Christ, we don't need to spend our lives wearing masks and saving face. Church, okay, Christian people, I mean, we've become masters at this. We all have PhDs in mask wearing. I mean, we're really, really good at making people believe one thing about us, saving face, always smiling, making people believe one thing about us when we know something else is true. Doesn't that get tiring? I mean, it wears me out. I mean, and this idea that we are united to Christ and our identity is now located in Him frees us from spending our lives wearing masks and saving face because we're free to admit our faults and failures. We've been clothed in the righteousness of Christ. So now, I don't have to pretend. I can admit weaknesses and faults and failures because my identity is not located in my ability or what I can get you to think about me. My identity is located in what God already thinks about me in Christ. It's liberation, folks. It's what the gospel does. Changes every relationship. Because now your relationships become not so much about what you need, because in Christ you have everything you need, so your relationships become about how you can serve and what you can give. Listen, this was so helpful to me over the course of the last year. Life cannot beat a man who doesn't care if he loses. Can't. Because Christ has won, you're free to lose. And if you're free to lose, if you don't care whether or not you lose, then life cannot beat you down. Life cannot win. This broken world and the fallen people in it cannot beat a man, a person who doesn't care if he loses. Because my identity is not located in my ability to win. It's located in Christ's victory, which is already accomplished and finished. For instance, when you understand that if you have Christ, you have nothing to lose, it enables you to live a life of great courage and sacrifice and generosity. You can live life giving up your place for others, not guarding in your place from others, because your value and worth is found in Christ, not your place. I will exhort you to do what John Calvin exhorts all of us to do in the introduction to his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Get to know yourself. Because as you get to know yourself, you will come to a greater, deeper realization of how desperately you need the gospel every day. The subtle ways we try to gain our own acceptance, our own approval, our own access. In Christ, my identity is secure, which frees me to give everything I have, because in Christ I have everything I need. That's what the world needs to see from the church. We're free people. The gospel has freed us from the bondage of sin and death. And it's liberated us by reminding us that everything we need and long for in Christ we have. I deal with people from time to time who have addictions. And one of the questions that I ask is, what are you missing in life that prompts you to go after your particular addiction? What is it? Pornography, drugs, alcohol, nicotine, whatever. When you make the decision to embrace this thing, you're making that decision because you're sensing that there's something in your life that's not there, and you believe this thing can give it to you. I said, figure out that first at a heart level. What are you looking for that you think this thing can provide for you? And then look at the gospel and ask, has Christ already provided that for me? That's how you grow. That's how you develop. That's how you mature.